This is lesson 21 for Jamaica School of Preaching, our study on church leadership and administration. This is number one of 3 classes that are left. And the lesson today is on the finances of the church. And so we want to begin with the idea that it's necessary for the church to have a budget. I'm not going to read all of the details in the handout. That's just for for your study and for your consideration, but I would venture to guess that most congregations have some kind of a budget. How well they do with that, I can't answer. But even with us as individuals, we need at least some way of managing our money, but especially in the management of the money that belongs to the Lord that God's people give for the work of the church. And there are comments that and statements in this particular lesson that were written by Brother L.R. Wilson, and naturally we will consider that we can be flexible in how a budget is actually managed by the church. I know that many of the congregations in Haiti and Jamaica and a lot of other countries where the church may not be as strong, may not have elders, you'll have to figure out a way for the men of the church to work on a budget. My suggestion would be to look for people who have maybe a business acumen, some way they know how to manage money and who understand the work of the church. You want to develop a committee. The congregation that I work with, as we've stated several times, does not have elders. And we do have a treasurer who takes care of making bank deposits and paying the bills for the church, but he doesn't make decisions about how the money is used. The men will come together and discuss these things, and we do it with in categories, I guess you could say. And the lesson that I should have sent in place of this one would have been the various works of the church and how to set up a program of work, but we can do that next week without any problem. We can still talk about a budget. Um, I would go along with the statement here about a permanent committee. Once you establish this committee of men to work on a budget, this, of course, would come after the church has figured out the works that it is going to do. If you're paying a preacher, if you are, you have to pay utility bills. You may or may not have to pay insurance on your buildings. I don't know. Whatever expenses the church incurs with regard to the preacher, or maybe money that's spent for educational materials or in the area of benevolence. Again, I should have done that lesson first, but I didn't. So we'll just have to work with this as we're able. Brother Solon, have you been a member of a congregation that has had some kind of a committee or group of men who work with the budget?
Yes, sir. I believe when I was in Haiti, there were 3 men. They were considered to be let me say, leaders of the congregation. So they would take care of these things. Well, they would oversee it, and they also had men, maybe about 7 to 8 of them were just like, deacons. So they were doing the work of deacons, serving tables and so on, who would take care of the budgets and all these things. But we did not have like appointed elders and deacons as, quote unquote.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that is very important is to understand how the money is going to be used, deciding how much the church would pay for the preacher, visiting preachers and things like that. And I should have done the other lesson first, but we have areas here that we can look at. And I think it's good to use people who have some idea about how to manage money. And I would also say it's kind of hard to know exactly how you do this when you don't have biblically established leadership, people you can trust. The money should never be left in the hands of one person. Uh, that's very dangerous and potentially dangerous anyway. And so if you look at, first of all, you want to plan a budget.
Yes.
And we don't really have a pattern in the New Testament as to how we do this, but we do have uh, things that have to be done. The gospel has to be preached. Um, you may or may not buy materials for your teachers, like paper or markers or pens or pencils or a whiteboard, things like that. But you'll have to consider the works of the church and put those into the budget. But it's also important to work with. I would want to say a couple of things here about the money. Simply preaching on giving does not really satisfy the needs of the church. When Paul was taking up money for the poor saints in Jerusalem, he had a purpose for that money. And I believe that gives us an idea, like in the church, okay, these are the things we want to do. And then you encourage the congregation, to give generously to these things. You'll get better contributions if the church has a purpose for giving than you would other than God has just commanded us to give. While that's true, people are more apt to give when they know what the money's going for and they like the ideas of the way the money's being used. And of course, they're biblical, like benevolence, first of all, to help the members of the local church, and then people who may not be members of the church can help them. And so you figure out, what the works of the church are and how you want to give, and then you start working on your budget. And it's good for the men to come together and discuss these things and consider all the options. And then you also know that you have to work with basically what the church is able to give. And perhaps as you get more detailed in the works of the church, and maybe even a new project of some sort, you explain it to the church and and inform them. And we'll get into that later. But you break your notice here in number 2, a breakdown of the budget. And you have preaching and teaching. And then then benevolence and operational. And when you start looking at these categories, okay, preaching and teaching, what will the church pay the preacher? Well, and what do you want to do in your teaching? And what are you capable of doing with your teaching? A lot of large congregations in the United States, they have a lot of money that the congregation will give, but even so, the elders and deacons or a committee will decide, okay, well, this is what we want to do. And maybe the teachers say, well, I need this, and we really need this for our classroom. And you would consider that, is it something that's really necessary? And is it something that the church can afford? And if you can't afford it, okay, you could say, okay, we want to get that for you, but we're going to have to wait until the church is given enough money to pay for it. But you break down your categories. And then if you have a building, you got your operational expenses. And I would say that if you probably pay an electric bill and things like that, maintenance for the building, whatever operational expenses the church has, and you just examine everything. How long will your roof last? Well, this roof is probably going to have to be replaced in X number of years, and you might, you need to consider things like that and figure out, well, what's going to happen what if we had a tornado and we didn't have insurance? You know, it could take the roof off the building. But you understand kind of what I'm getting at. Start thinking about all the things you have to pay for. And I want to throw this in here. I've been doing a lot of thinking about brethren who get support from the United States or other places. The sooner a congregation can become self-supporting, the better off it will be. It will be stronger. You'll feel better about the Lord's work. You'll know what you're able to do. And I don't think it's wrong for congregations to help preachers in other countries, say from the United States. But there's a point where the church needs to start taking care of its own preacher. And maybe just to think about doing the work. So, okay, what do we think we need, and what can we pay the preacher? And what does he need if he's going to be full-time with the church? What does he need to make a reasonable salary? And these kinds of things come into play in your discussion. And then you start looking, this is a part of developing your budget. And then, if the congregation is able, maybe you can do some kind of mission work, and be sure you have money on hand to help the poor. I don't know how you all do it in Jamaica. I'm assuming the congregations have some kind of bank account that you keep money in. I don't know. I don't know if you just take, and you've got to have some place to keep your money. And it's important that you keep up with the money and make sure that it's in a good, safe bank account. But you start looking at all these various things, and I know every congregation has its own particular needs. Like the building where I preach has been paid for a long time, so we don't have a building payment, but we do have to maintain it. And sometimes, something happens that you're not expecting. And we had to have some help a couple of years ago on the roof of our building because we didn't have the money. And there's nothing wrong with asking other people to help, but at the same time, we want to do the best we can to take care of our own expenses. So you start breaking down your budget. Then number 3 is like your fixed and flexible expenses. Like some expenses are fixed, like the preacher, the preacher should get a set amount of money, and he should be able to get paid whenever the church does that, if it's by the week or however it's done. that should not change. You have an idea and if you get somebody to help work in the office, you might say, well, we really need somebody to work in the office of this building. And I don't know how you all do it in Jamaica, but most congregations here have secretary who answers the phone and takes care of things like that. And maybe, I don't know if you're able to do that or not. These are just things to think about, but there are certain things that should not change. Like, your utility bill, whatever it is, if it's water, electricity, whatever, those things are going to be fixed. And you need to make sure that you maintain enough money in the budget when those bills come due that they can be paid. And you're not, running out of money. And then there may be some things that are flexible. There are some things that are flexible. Like, when we worked on our budget at Adel, we looked like, when we worked on it for 2023, which we've already done it, we looked at what we spent in certain categories. And we, like for benevolence, well, this is how much we spent. Okay, so we need to have at least that much money budgeted in 2023 for benevolence. This is what we spent on office supplies. And there may have been some unusual expense, like for the office. Maybe we didn't, but let's say we had to buy a new copier or something. Well, you don't buy a new copier every year, so you may not have to plan for that for 2023, but have enough money in there that you can take care of. I think that people who don't ever have any money need to study what we're talking about here, and churches that don't ever have any, how to look at their expenses and make a budget, and not only make it, but stick with it. And don't pull money out and just start spending it because it's in the bank, because something else may go lacking or wanting if you pay for something that you didn't have in the budget. And that's why it's important to have that committee. You may have one person that pays the bills, but that person should not be making decisions on how the money is spent. It's just their job to make sure things are paid. And and another point here too, if you owe money to the electric company, or I don't know if you pay for water bills or whatever, don't be late on those things. Pay those things on time, because it's a reflection on the church when you don't pay your bills.
Yes, sir.
And it's important, to make sure that those things are taken care of. And if you're supporting, maybe I don't know if congregations there, if they're supporting some preacher to go out somewhere else to preach on a regular basis, make sure he gets his money. To be good managers is to be responsible with the money that you have. Mike, do you have any comments about this?
Well, excuse me, I think that everything you said is really good. The word that comes to my mind is stewardship. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 2, Paul said that which is required of a steward is a man be found faithful. And the money that we're talking about is God's money. And so we want to make sure that we use that money for his cause. And, we don't want to be wasteful. And as you said a minute ago, how we use or don't use that money is a reflection on the church. And one of the things that maybe if you would talk a little bit about it, Roger, I know that in the breakdown of expenditures, you're, in some ways you're forecasting, but you can also look at your spending in the past. I think that the elders, or those who, if in a situation where you don't have elders, God's going to hold us responsible for how we use his money. or in some instances, if we don't use his money. In other words, the church is not a bank. And I think that, there needs to be, as you said a minute ago, money set aside for growth, expansion, potentially there may be situations that arise, like you mentioned, a congregation may lose their roof in a tornado or hurricane or whatever. And so those expenditures need to be considered. But at the same time, the money, there needs to be transparency and communication, and the money that comes in needs to be used for the work of the church and to the glory of God, if that makes sense.
Yes. And talking about being good stewards, if a church owns a building, keep it up, because that represents God's people in the community. I do not subscribe to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but I know when I see their buildings, they don't look run down either. And I think if, to the best of our ability, maybe sometimes we don't have the money to keep our buildings looking good, but that may be because we haven't planned for it. If we're going to own a building and you're going to put God's name on it, keep it looking good, because the people in the community judge things, whether it's fair or not, they do. And make sure that you take care of your preacher. I'm not talking about paying him more money than, than necessarily than other people, but pay him enough to live off of. And so you start looking at fixed expenses and flexible expenses. There may be some things talking about flexible expenses, and this is in the other lesson too, that like I say, I should have done it first, but let's say there are things you'd like to do, but you can't do them now. Okay. Figure out, well, what would you like to do? And what do you think it would cost, and build up to it. I have a bank account with an online bank, and they have an option on that account that's called buckets. And there's a preacher that the congregation that I work for that we support in Nicaragua. And the church gives me the money, and then another congregation's helping him, and then I put it in my account because I'm able to get it to him. But I keep that money separate. It's in a separate account, and so when it comes time to send his money, the money's there. And what I'm getting at is you categorize, and if you have fixed expenses, make sure the money's there when it comes time to pay. You're not late. And don't overcommit. Don't commit to things you can't do. I know sometimes things happen, like you may make a commitment, and maybe a family that's able to be fairly generous in their giving, maybe they move. Or maybe the person that makes the most money gets real sick or dies or something. You can't help that. But then when those kinds of things happen, sometimes you have to make adjustments. But make sure you look at the adjustments carefully and you take care of the things you need to. So when you start looking at the expenses, make sure you pay on time. Don't overcommit. Pay what you've committed to. And then you start adopting the budget. So you start talking about, okay, these are the things we've covered. And you should have every faithful man in the church involved in this discussion. You all have to decide how you figure out how you're going to do that.
Yes, sir.
But and we don't have 12-year-old boys. I did have my 17-year-old son in our meetings just to listen to what was going on. Well, he was actually 20. He was 20 years old, to listen to what was going on and try to learn about how we did things. And, he didn't say very much, but we were teaching him. I do not believe the church budget should be kept secret from the church. We'll get into that in a moment, but look at number 4 in adopting the budgets. Okay. These are the things we want to do. And these are the things we're capable of doing. And this is what we're able to spend money to commit to this project. Okay. We can pay the preacher X number of dollars and it won't be a problem. We make sure that the utility bills are paid and the money is there. And then anything that you want to do extra, you start looking at this and then you say, okay, I know this lesson says presenting it to the elders. And if you don't have elders, you still have to do the Lord's work. And everybody looks over everything you've discussed. And I did a lesson some weeks ago on how to have a church meeting. And anytime you have a meeting, you ought to have somebody that's keeping the minutes, to record what's being discussed and make notes. I know that takes time, but I also know I mentioned something the other day and somehow some notes on something that I had mentioned had been misplaced. And I remembered making a statement about something that we had agreed to do. But for some reason, the notes weren't available. And somebody says, I don't remember that. And I'm not saying that I'm right and this person was wrong. I'm just saying when you write it down, you know what you said. And that way you don't have to rely on your memory. It's possible that I was mistaken and what I thought I remembered. It's possible that the other brother was mistaken, but if it's on paper, we know what we said. And when you make a budget, you write it out. Okay, this is for this, this is for this, this is for this, this is how much this is going to be. And I suggest that you look at it monthly. Okay, this is what we need a month. And a month could be 5 Sundays, it could be 4 Sundays. But either way, this is what we're going to pay the preacher, however you work that out, what we're going to need to keep the building up, to pay our utilities, to have material for the teachers to teach. Maybe you need to build some new pews. Well, put it in the budget. We're going to need to build some pews in 2023. Okay, you're going to need to know what those will cost and who's going to do it and get a price. And you start working on those things, and then everybody goes over the budget and say, okay, anything that needs to be adjusted, adjust it. Anything that needs to be added, oh, we didn't cover this. I think this needs to be in here. Okay. And then everybody goes over it and say, okay, this looks good to us, and you agree to it. And then you have it. And once you have your budget, you look it over, and then it needs to be presented to the church. The church gives to God for the work of the church. And it's not right to keep those things a secret. I know some congregations, they may have a preacher, an associate minister, and a secretary, and they may put all that in one category. Say, well, this is what we're spending for these 3 workers. And then say, well, how much is the preacher getting paid? Well, it could be in some congregations, the preacher's the only person that gets paid. I don't mind the church knowing what I get paid. I don't have a problem with it. If the men sit back there and agree to it, everybody ought to know what it is that's in the church. Some people want to keep that a secret, and I don't know why they'd want to do that.
Hey, Roger,
Yes, sir.
how do you deal with, you mentioned setting the budget and transparency. How do you deal, for example, like the preacher? Or let's say that some of the members in the church are not pleased with how the elders are using or not using the money. And so they withhold their contribution and say, well, I'm just going to send my contribution somewhere else. How would you recommend to these men, how would you recommend to them how to deal with that?
If somebody does not agree with the budget and they want to send their contribution somewhere else, the first thing I'd want to do is have a meeting of maybe 2 or 3 of the men, especially when you don't have elders, and have a conversation with these people privately and say, we have gone over to explain to these people, we have gone over all the details in this budget, and this is what we believe as a group of men that that we need to spend money on. And I think, why wasn't that person in the meeting? If you don't have elders, if you have elders, not everybody necessarily needs to be in there. Now, the last thing I'd want to do is recommend that if you can't go along with the way that we're doing the work here, you might need to go somewhere else. I would never say that up front, and that'd be the last thing I'd want to say. I'd want to try to keep them there and say, well, why are you objecting to this? What's the problem with it? Well, I don't think that the Lord's money needs to be spent on that. Okay, what's wrong with it? And if it comes under a category of the work of the Lord's work, there has to be a measure of I can't think of the word I want to use, some flexibility there. Some things are a matter of judgment, even though it's accomplishing the Lord's work. Can you give me an example, Mike, of something? I'm not talking about names, but something that may have come up that people objected to?
Well, I'm just thinking, I don't have any specific thing in mind per se in terms of people not agreeing with how the money is used. But for example, maybe a congregation doesn't feel like there's full transparency on how the money is being used, maybe allocated. You mentioned a moment ago, like salaries, I'm with you. I don't think there's really, there's no, I don't think we ought to try to hide anything. We ought to be transparent. And I don't have a problem with people knowing, what each person on the payroll makes. But there are some congregations, let's say they allocate X amount of money to missions or X amount of money to building and maintenance or whatever, but there's no real general breakdown and allocation line by line. And so there are questions in people's minds is, okay, how's that money being used and to whom is that money being given? And so they're somewhat reluctant to give in that context.
When I visited a
I can give you an example.
Excuse me, Ian. When I visited a congregation in a certain place, they had a list of all their missionaries on a board in the auditorium. They did not tell the church how much they were giving to each missionary. But I would venture to say, if the elders were asked, well, how much are you all giving to Roger Leonard for the mission work he's doing? They would probably tell them. I don't know that you need to plaster those numbers all over the place, but I think if somebody asks, say, well, we're sending this much money to this family in this place because that's what they need. And,
Well, and Roger, elders, we're talking about an autonomous congregation, and their authority is in the realm of expediency. And so there's a trust level there to some extent in terms of, okay, these men have been placed in this position, and we're going to trust that the money that's being given on a regular basis is going to be allocated and used properly. And it's their, that's their call. Now, they don't have the right to do something unscriptural, but if they want to send so much to a missionary or whatever, then that falls within their discretion.
Brother Ian, what were you going to say?
Right. So I was at this congregation when we had a discussion, and the discussion was about, for example, the way how the money was spent on benevolence, and it was a heated discussion on the amount, because you see, the thing about it is that some congregations believe that, well, we all do believe that you serve your church members first. And so somebody was in problems, and then, they wanted to give this amount, and somebody was like, no, this person is a backslider, was left the church several years. We don't think this amount would be feasible, because at the end of the day, we do still have people up here that need it, and they are still members of the church or remain as members. And so there had to be a mature discussion around the matter for us to come to a conclusion as to, okay, this is what the church has decided to give towards this venture. And these are the factors to consider. There was a time I was also seeking support, and one of the questions they asked, they said, is should the church support orphanages, etc., etc., etc. That one got me stumped. I took 5 minutes to answer it, because really and truly, I wasn't sure whether or not that should be a part of the church's budget, or it should just be a donation from the church. I eventually went with a one-time donation, or a donation as requested, but not necessarily a part of the church budget. Those are things that I've seen, people have discussions about when it comes to budgeting in a church.
This is where, thank you for that. This is where you have a committee of people that have some, a reasonable ability to make these kinds of decisions. And there may be specific cases that come up for benevolence, for example, and it's not the church's decision on how that money's spent. You can't let I don't like this phrase, but I'm going to use it. You can't let the tail wag the dog. The leaders of the church have to examine these situations, and you need to do so very carefully. It's okay. These people, are they faithful? And if they are, do we want to help them, and what is their need? And ask the question, is anybody else helping them? Is their family helping them? Because sometimes the family may or may not be helping them. And really, my first obligation as a Christian, if, for example, my mother is in need, and that's where Paul talked about those who were being widows indeed, when he was talking about helping the widows. My first obligation as a child of my mother is to help her. And if I, say, this is what I'm able to do, and I said, well, could the church help do this? I mean, there are always more factors than maybe are on the surface, but you can't let the church as a whole make this decision, because you're going to have chaos. This is where the leaders look at these things, and this is why, brothers Ian and Solon, you need to start working on getting elders in the church and deacons. It may
Yes,
not
sir.
come today. It may not come for 25 years, but God's plan is to have spiritually qualified men to oversee the church to deal with these kinds of things. But to let the church make the whole church make that decision, it's going to cause trouble. And examine every case. Does that help, Ian?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So
No, I don't think the decision that we're talking about now wasn't among members of the church. And we didn't bring it to a members meeting. But when you have multiple men come together to make that decision, it does affect the way how. Yes, that's the problem. You have several men who have different beliefs coming together to make that decision.
well, this is where this question that you're talking about is worthy of discussion. There are congregations in the United States that do not believe that people outside the church should receive money from the local church budget. They're called non-institutional. They wouldn't help a children's home out of the church budget. They wouldn't feed a hungry family out of the church budget if they're not members of the church. Now, there aren't many congregations like that, but there are some. But even so, the congregation I preach for, we believe that you can use the money from the budget to help non-Christians. But I will tell you this, we're very judicious about that. Let me give you an example. There was a young woman who came to the building pushing a baby stroller. She just wanted money. And we were talking, and we helped her a time or two. And sometimes it's just us as individuals, we may give somebody a little something. But one of the men that kind of deals with that, he's on the benevolence committee, asked her about working. She says, "Oh, I can't work. I'm disabled and I would lose my disability." Well, this woman's about 22, 23 years old. And the sad thing is we got a lot of people like that in this country. And I'm not going to help people who can work, but won't. But there are people who have come and they have a legitimate need and they're doing the best they can, and we may help them some, but we don't do it on a regular basis. Do you have congregations in Jamaica or maybe in Haiti that are against using the church's money to help people outside the church?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
It's-
I believe we should do that.
It's not a doctrine, but it's frowned upon. In other words, it's not highly discussed. Like the case I told you, it was like a one-off case. It's not very highly discussed. The churches do believe in benevolence outside. I can tell you comfortable that we do believe in benevolence outside of just the church walls, but it's not that it's something that it's not done as much so I can make a very wide assessment. The congregations that I have been a part of, they have been a part of the feeding of the homeless in Ocho Rios, where I was a member of that team in Ocho Rios. They were part of the feeding of the homeless there, but they didn't contribute to that financially. What happened is that somebody else contributed financially and all the members just went out and did the feeding. So sometimes we may take that, what you call passive approach to it. When we do take an active approach, it is normally talked about at length, and then, if somebody asks for it, and more than likely this person is either a member of the church or a regular attendee, but it's not a part of the overall budget unless a third party is involved with the sponsorship.
Okay. So those are things you have to work out. And maybe you have members of the church who are always in need, but they're not managing their money very well. This is where you men as preachers need to study money management and try to help those people. Some people would get upset if you tried to do that, but they'll go out and spend their money on things they don't need. And then the next thing you know, they don't have any. That goes back to what Brother Mike was saying about being good stewards. I believe I'm to be a steward of everything I have. And we can teach people that. Now, these have been good points. I appreciate you bringing them up. So you start looking at adopting a budget and looking at it. Then, this is a word we don't use every day, but this came from the material I used, and getting number 5, getting the budget subscribed. So you have a budget, and then going back to what Brother Mike was saying is you get the members to subscribe to it. There are a couple of ways that people, the elders do budgets in the United States. Some of them don't tell the members anything much. They just say, okay, this is our budget for 2023, and this is how much you need to give, but they don't tell the church where it's going. I don't believe that's biblical. I don't believe it's good. If I've got any common sense at all, okay, we've started to support a new missionary, for example, in a foreign country, and we've decided that we can afford to pay this much money for him and his family. You put his name out there and you tell the church about it, and you say, we're going places with the gospel by supporting this man where we can't go. And you explain these things, and you could say, we've had an increase in our electric bill from 2020, say 2021 to 2022. And so we figure it's going to cost more in 2023. So we've had to increase the amount for that. Maybe taxes go up. I guess you pay taxes on buildings in Jamaica. I don't know, but we do here. But anyway, certain things go up, and you explain, this is why this is this amount of money. And the preacher needed more money. Because if the economy changes and his support doesn't change, then he's going backward. And some people say, well, we're going backward too. So, okay, do you want our preacher to do without? And I'm not talking about making him rich, not at all, but making sure he's taken care of, and explain it. I know if you start this, you're going to have some people, like Brother Mike said, who are going to resist it. And that's where you need to be patient and kind and explain. And I don't think the preacher needs to be doing this. You get somebody in the church that's kind of the committee head for the budget. It's okay. And explain it. Explain how you came up with this budget. We talked about this for several weeks, and we've worked it out. And these are the things that we believe need to be done. But I would also say you should have done some background investigation. You should have gone to your teachers and say, what do you think you need next year for teaching? Let's take it to our committee and discuss it. Talk to the people who are taking care of the building. Do you know of anything that we need some money for to make sure that it's taken care of? And you've polled, as it were, the congregation to see what the needs are before you ever build your budget. And then when you present it, they know what you're talking about. Yeah, we talked about this, and so, okay, we could not do this much for the teaching materials, but we can do this much. And so that's the best we can do for now. And if people will give more, we can do that. Just like Mike said, be transparent, but also explain it. Be organized with it. And I think that, and then it's okay, this is how much we're going to have to give each week to do this. We have to have at least this much money each week. Now, you brothers know that one week may be X number of a certain amount. Next week, it may be less. And then in 2 weeks, it may be twice as much. But you look at the average. And I would look at it, say, for 3 months. It's okay. 3 months have gone by in 2023. This has been our budget, but we're not meeting it. And we're not meeting it, which means there's some things that we wanted to do that we can't do. Or you could say, this was our budget, but you all are giving more, and praise the church for it. So, this is great. You're giving more than we had budgeted for. And that just gives us a little extra cushion if something comes up that's a surprise. Anytime you can brag on the church, you're going to win people's hearts. And even if you're not meeting the budget, say, we really need to up this a little bit. And if we can up it 2% or whatever, to do this, or there are just some things that we're not going to be able to do. I want to say put a lot of time and effort into this. It may take 6 months. Especially if a church has never been really on top of building a budget. Now we're down here at number 5. So you present it to the church, and some congregations have done what they call pledge or purpose cards, and you'll pass those cards out. And now you may not want to do that in Jamaica, but when you have elders, you don't even, they don't have to put their name on it. You could just say, okay, our family will give this much. And then I would say, don't put your name on it. Don't tell them not to put their names on it. And then the committee comes together and say, this is what people have committed to do. And at least we know we can at least do this much. And then say, but if you didn't tell it, some people don't want to tell what they're going to give. That's fine. But at least you have an idea. Yes, Ian.
Now, I've seen churches in New York. In New York is the only place I've actually seen it so far, where churches, what they do is that they give everyone that they put envelopes, the offering envelopes, in the back of the seat. So everyone is instructed, put your offering inside the envelopes. Now, you can write your name on the envelope if you wish to, or you may choose not to, but they do have the space for it. On that envelope, now, they have boxes that you tick. So for the Church of Christ at King's, that they believe in some form of tithing, you actually see a box for tithing there. I do question their doctrine, but hey, let's move on. But for other congregations, I do see a box for benevolence, offering, and other specifics. So I would put like $100 in it, and then right beside offering $20, and right beside benevolence $20, and right beside something else another 50, and another 10 for something else. I believe that would be a better method of getting it done, and people don't have to put their name on their offerings either. They just tick the boxes and write the amount for each beside it, and so they don't have to give multiple times. What do you think?
Well, I know that Paul took up a special contribution for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And I know that's what he's talking about in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. And obviously, if let's say I was a member of the congregation at Corinth back then, okay, we've got a separate collection we're making for those saints. And then whatever I put in the collection plate for the local church. So there is a measure there is an example of that. What we do here, I know at one point where in another congregation I was a member of, we gave our contribution and the elders just used it where they needed to. I didn't designate it, but there was a time that the congregation was wanting to build a new building, and then they had envelopes for that. And when they got to a certain amount of money, then they went and bought property. And then they got a little more money and they started building the building. But that was a separate account. So it's not wrong to do that. I would think if you've already made a budget for benevolence, education, the preacher, building maintenance, just put your collection in there and let the treasurer and the committee use it however they need to. When you limit it like that, something else may go wanting. I don't do it that way unless, like I mentioned, there's a special project, like for a new building. Or maybe some member there, maybe their house burned down in Jamaica. Okay, we want to help them. And we're going to do a separate collection on top of what you're already giving. Not, but and let's try to help these people get their house fixed or whatever. So you just analyze the situations. I don't know that there's any fixed way of doing it, and whatever works. So, but you have to come to a point where you present it to the church and say, and this material that I've given you is not inspired, of course. It's just some suggestions. And so it's just things to look at. Move down to number 6, Brother Solon, on points to remember in planning our giving. And let's take about I've got exactly 2:30 here. Let's come back in about 10 minutes, take a break.
Yes, sir.
Sounds good.